I'm okay now. No, I've moved on to this point. That's it. Shivaraman, I had a regulation mask which I took off since I found nobody else was having a mask.
I'm not wearing one either. Not inside the house.
No, but I got Mohan, so I thought I will maintain a distance.
We have just been joined by the political counselor from the German embassy in New Delhi, Mr. Seller.
Hello.
Group captain, your voice is muted and live streaming started, sir.
Thank you. Now, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm welcome to each one of you who have joined Zoom at the moment. May I request to kindly mute yourself and also remove the video so that the speakers, the focus is on the speakers. I request you to do that. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation. And before I call upon the speakers and also introduce distinguished panelists for this evening, let me briefly tell you what's happening in MMA so that if by any chance you miss, you don't miss them. Tomorrow morning, we have a very interesting talk, COVID-19, the way forward for banking. Sheshashai, who is the vice chairman of Hinduja Group, is going to be talking to us, along with Mr. Kamakoti, who is the MD and CEO of City Union Bank Industrial Economics. We are bringing this to you with joined with the Conrad Stifting to know what's happening in the banking sector. Then on the 1st of May, again, we have an interesting talk on the theme, socio-economic implications of India healthcare response to COVID-19. We have got the 3 outstanding panelists, Sharan Subramaniam, MD of Roche Diagnostic, with Arti Sivanand, partner Jay Saga, and Preeta Venkatachalam, his partner, Red Spam, is going to be talking with us. Then on the 1st of May, quickly 6 p.m., marketing for the future. We have got C.K. Ranganathan, founder and managing director of Kevin Care, along with David Appasamy, who will be having a fireside chat and jointly with Koshin. Not this event. Most of the SMEs will immensely benefit by this event, where we are bringing you live marketing for the future. On 2nd of May, again, we are bringing you a success story of it was done by Silambam 3000 Years and Bharat Bala, who is a screenplay writer, producer, director, along with Aishwarya Manivandan, who is a world Silambam champion. She's going to be there talking to us at success story. On 3rd of May, again, we have a COVID-19 impact of Indian politics. 3 outstanding politicians, Mafai Pandirajan, minister from the Tamil Nadu government, Palnivel, who is a MLA from Tamil Nadu government, again, Emma Chandran, member of parliament from Kerala. So these are some of the programs which are lined up for you. Now, coming to today's event, we're all eagerly looking forward, is geopolitical and geoeconomic consequences of COVID-19. And we got to outstanding speakers who will walk miles to listen to him, Mr. M K Narayanan, who will be used later by Mr. Arsh V. Pant. Arsh V. Pant is head of strategic studies for New Delhi, and Arsh Pant will be in conversation with Narayanan. And we have the privilege of also welcoming Mr. Peter Rimley, head of India operations, Conrad Stifting. I will now have the privilege of introducing Mr. Peter Rimley. I will request him to please deliver the introductory remarks. Peter Rimley is the current resident representative of Conrad Stifting office in India, has a law degree in Fredericksburg and University, as well as a second in law. After a stint with the jurist, judges, lecturer, and is also joined public office, head of division of the State Ministry of Interior. He served on a number of important assignments, including Anti-Corruption Commission, Republic of Indonesia. Earlier, he was the resident representative at Lebanon, director of Rules and Law Program at Conrad Stifting. It's a warm welcome to Mr. Remle. Thank you so much for all the support from the Conrad Stifting, and we have been able to take some phenomenal programs to members of MMA and the worldwide large audience. May I now request you please deliver the introductory remarks.
Yes, thank you, Group Captain, and Your Excellency, Mr. Narayanan. I don't know if our member of German Parliament, Mr. Christian Hirte, has already joined, but I'd like to welcome him anyway. Distinguished Professor Pant and all the other participants. First of all, I see Mr. Hirte has joined. Welcome to our round. So the COVID-19 crisis has undoubtedly geopolitical and geoeconomic ramifications worldwide, some of which we can see and assess now, and some that will be felt in distant future only. It's not the only reason. Many of the things COVID-19 is just triggering and speeding up developments, but it is not an only development. As resident representative of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in India, let me offer you a rather European and also a transatlantic perspective on the impact of COVID-related consequences. Jean Monnet, one of the fathers of the European Union, said that Europe will be forged in crisis. So it was in a sense reassuring to learn that in the face of the spreading coronavirus pandemic, EU leaders were discussing the most ambitious way, on the one side, to knit their countries even closer together, while deciding about a gigantic finance program to help ease the burden of the economic downturn in most of the European countries, like in many countries of the world currently now. There's even a discussion that there is the need for a new kind of Marshall Plan, a new European recovery program. For over 70 years, European states have always looked up to the United States as a big brother for taking the lead in such a global crisis management scenario. But what is different in this time? This time, East and West Europeans alike have been watching the US response to the COVID-19 pandemic with alarm. The current unpredictability became particularly clear in view of recent US plans to freeze funding for the World Health Organization. Maybe that is a comment a large country and wealthy country like the US can do without WHO, but most African, most Latin American, and many Asian countries for sure cannot do it. And if I look at how the US is handling the corona crisis there, it raises doubts in me that they could handle it alone. But that step of moving out of the financing of WHO was felt by Europeans as yet another piece of evidence that the US is withdrawing from its role as a responsible global leader, which amidst the current pandemic was needed more than ever before. In this context, the COVID-19 crisis is raising questions about American power, reliability, and trustworthiness, as also about the future of the so far stable transatlantic relationships and a multilateral order post-COVID-19. Trump's decision to impose a unilateral ban on commercial flights from Europe without any prior consultation with European allies was another demonstrably low point in transaction communication. Nonetheless, Europeans have become accustomed by now to Trump's decisions not going hand in hand with European ones anymore, what was long time the case, and also learning about US decisions through tweets and newspapers rather than through traditional diplomatic channels. If I want to be sarcastic, I could say he has anticipated the corona crisis and that we do many things online, by web, whatever, and use those means ahead. Nevertheless, the seeming abdication of global leadership by the US remains deeply disheartening for European states, which have experienced the opposite with previous US presidents in power. Irrespective of who in former times sat in the Oval Office, Europeans have tended to look to the United States in a crisis because of its unique and long-standing ability to bring the world together. And I'll just give an example. Not so long ago, similar pandemic, not that large than coronavirus, but for example, in 2014, it was the United States that pulled nations together to combat Ebola. The real vacuum of global leadership created by the US means that the process of recovery from COVID-19 will be harder and longer for everyone. I do not expect the European Union to step in. It would overburden the EU, and it does not have the capability to step into those big shoes. But also, at least for a long time to go, I do not expect China to step into those shoes. Not only because a lack of acceptance of China as a global leader, but mainly due to a lack of capacity. Look at India, 1.3 billion people. It is difficult to administer, to govern such a large country. China is even bigger. That's already a burden enough. And I don't see the capacity that they could sort of rule the world or be a ruler or leader, at least, of the world in the foreseeable future. They will definitely try to gain more influence, but not step into the big shoes of the United States. At a time when the US should have created coalitions with Europe and other partners, for example, in the Indo-Pacific, maybe India specifically, it has failed to do so. As tens of thousands of Italians died from the disease and Rome pleaded for help in early March, the US unexpectedly remained silent. What came on top were rumors that the White House even tried to secure exclusive rights to a vaccine being developed by a German company, and that only further diminished the US reputation and created further unnecessary tensions in an already heated scenario. But to be fair, Italy was also disappointed about the reaction of the EU and of Germany, but that is another field to be discussed. Many European countries are engaged in extensive domestic debates about ways in which they could have saved more lives. The European Union has to face the criticism that its crisis management has not been as functional as it should have been, and that crisis management for the most affected countries such as Italy has been slow and only effective after a lot of death had already happened. Now, I don't want to defend the EU now, but I want to explain something. Health issues, health policy is not a matter, is not a subject for EU policies, for EU coordination. So in that way, I would even defend the EU. The technical term would be communitization. Trade is communitized, that's handled by the EU, but health issues is handled by the nation states and even in a federal state by the smaller states. So the EU has been accused of not being able to take decision on this own, difficult in a matter where they're not even responsible for. China stepped in quickly, sending masks and instruments to Italy, not always functional, but there was definitely the political sign. Not everyone in Europe, on the other side, is falling for China's narrative, representing itself as a de facto problem solver and global leader in the corona crisis. And just a day ago, I read that there were secret meetings, or they tried to do, by Chinese officials with German officials to sort of explain them and trigger the Chinese point of view. And I think we have a fireside meeting, to use that term. I think that attempt has backfired. The question is, as the US image as a leader ally seems to have taken a huge hit, what impact might there be on the future of multilateralism? And this is a topic where Germany is interested in and where India is also a large supporter of multilateralism. So if President Trump secures a second term, this crisis could ultimately shift the balance of power on the European continent, as even Central and Eastern European states have started to doubt American intentions and even the ability to be a global leader, while raising serious doubts about the reliability of US security guarantees. In such a scenario, the US may come to realize that its security commitments alone are not enough to carry several relationships forward, thus making space for Chinese attempts to take advantage, not take over, but take advantage of the way the UN responds to the crisis. As this situation is a test of American and Chinese leaderships alike, failures will extract great costs over the long term in humanitarian and economic terms. Now, can the EU function as a strategic anchor at least? And how does Germany fit into this role? The US, which is also an unpredictable partner for India, and the expansionist policies of India's neighbor China currently provide a window of opportunity to deepen and broaden the EU-India relations. During his visit to India in March 2018, German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier said that in concert with France, Germany could serve as a new strategic anchor for India. Germany is already India's most important European trade partner, and well known for its technological expertise, and of late also as a preferred destination for Indian students. The challenge is now to strengthen existing ties and to intensify exchange in other areas post-COVID-19. Germany and the EU are civil powers as they uphold principles such as the international rule of law and stand for multilateral engagement. In order to promote such principles further, it's crucial that the EU accepts its role as an innovative global leader. There is a need to emphasize that major global challenges such as migration, terrorism, climate change, and global health crisis can only be tackled by a coalition of like-minded allies. I would say that's the minimum. It would be better if the world would tackle it, because I cannot see crises like the pandemic we have now being solved on a national level. We see every nation is trying with its means, but the coronavirus doesn't know any borders and it doesn't know any restrictions. So that is something what also should be addressed without national borders in an international alliance. Ladies and gentlemen, whether we like it or not, we are at the inflection point with regard to global future, and we have to tread extremely carefully. Our decisions will affect future generations and decades to come. So I'd like to thank all for coming, for the presence, for participating, and for listening to the points. And I pass it back to Group Captain. And thank you for your attention. And now let's open our minds for many more interesting points.
Thank you, Mr. Peter, for the opening remarks. Now we'll go for the conversation. If you would like to use Honorable Christian now, or would like to bring him in later, I leave it to you. Very warm welcome to you. The privilege you joined us, actually. Let me proceed further the event. And Professor Arsh V. Pant is the Director of Studies and Head of Strategic Studies Program at Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi. He also joined appointment with the Department of Defense Studies and King's India Institute as Professor of International Relations at King's College, London. Visiting Professor of IIM Bangalore, visiting Fellow of the Center for the Advanced Studies in India, University of Pennsylvania. An Emerging Leader Fellow at the Australia-India Institute, University of Melbourne. The recent books also include Directions, Indian Foreign Policy, Indian Practices, and India's Nuclear Policy, Handbook on India Defense Policy, and many more. Professor Pant writes regularly for the various Indian international media, which also includes Wall Street Journal, on Time, Telegraph, and many more. Very welcome to you, Mr. Pant. I will now take over the session and introduce Mr. Excellency Narayanan and over to you, Mr. Pant. You unmute yourself, please.
Thank you very much, Group Captain. I just wanted to raise this with Peter, if Honorable Member of Parliament, I was told that he would be having some initial comments. Does he want to join at this point, or should we bring him in during the conversation?
As you like. Should I start, or?
I think please go ahead. Yes, I think I'll take the conversation with Mr. Narayanan forward later. First,
So first, hello to all of you. It's an uncommon
just go ahead,
format.
sir.
Is it working?
Yes, yes, please go ahead, sir.
It is.
Clear. Shankar, may I request all to mute, please?
Yes, sir. I will do that.
So, hello again from Germany. I hope my connection will be fine and you can understand me. For me, it's an uncommon format. Thanks for invitation to all of you, especially to Peter Rimmele, who asked me to join in, and for Pankaj. I was asked to focus on 5 points. What is German's perspective on post-COVID geopolitics and geoeconomic situation? As you probably know, at the moment, our German situation is quite well in comparison to many other countries in Europe or worldwide, especially on the focus on the COVID problems. And if you see our budget situation, we are in a much better situation than most of the other countries because our fixation on budget controls in the last years. And at the moment, we are capable to give billions of euros to support our economy. Despite that, we will be hit by the economic shocks due to COVID-19. Just a moment, our government told that we will probably have 6.8% of decline of our economy this year, and that's only the actual situation if the pandemic won't much longer. But it might get worse if the lockdown is necessary for a longer period than we know and expect now. Another problem for Germany is our dependence on supply chains. For some of our products, we need imports from all over the globe, which are not working probably due to the pandemic. And as much as we depend on import, it is necessary to export our goods, especially into the European, but also to the world market. And we see sharp declines in both fields. So there are problems we can tackle in Germany on ourselves. For example, securing the jobs of over 1 million employees thanks to short-time allowance. But we will not recover to our former strength if the EU and the whole world does not. So how will the EU react? Peter Rimmel just told that the EU has only competence in a couple of fields, not on every field. And at the moment, the EU is focused mainly on internal problems. The member states suffer on different degrees under the COVID-19 outbreak. So it seems that we have to solve those problems first before we can move on to a broader perspective. I want to mention that Germany will take the EU Council presidency for the second half of the year, starting on July 1st. And as for the aftermath of the outbreak, we have to have an eye on the development in Africa. Our southern neighbor is at the very beginning of the pandemic of COVID-19, and the problems will worsen there as well. And we might need special programs to support Africa in its fight against the virus. And if we get a vaccine, we probably need to help to distribute it across the continent. In the crisis, we see increased propaganda from Russia and from China. We just heard it. Russian help supplies were distributed in Italy with much public attention. On social media, Russian bots try to discredit EU's work in the crisis, and same goes for China. Beijing even tried to influence German officials to shed a good light on China crisis management. How about the post-US-China relations? As we can see, all major countries of the world are affected of the COVID-19 outbreak. China seems to have control over this disease at the moment. And the United States give the impression of acting too late. But on the other hand, the US is home to one of the most innovative economies on this planet. Between Beijing and Washington started a quarrel about whose fault this disease is. In my opinion, this isn't a topic to help produce the outbreak, but to gather your own people behind your narrative and strengthen your own political position in your own country. This applies to China's Xi Jinping as much as to the US Trump's administration. And with all eyes on COVID-19, we should not forget about the presidential election in the United States in the end of this year. This will affect the relations between those two much more than the pandemic, probably. COVID-19 certainly strains the relations, which were tested even before the outbreak, but won't change what was already happening. China more and more challenged and will challenge the US supremacy. This will go on. What does it mean for Russia, Japan, Korea, and at least even and especially for your own country in India? Korea is at the moment at least an international role model for their management of the COVID-19 outbreak. It is not as affected as much as most other countries, and it didn't shut its economy down. But Korea depends on open markets and export. And with sharp declines in economic growth around the globe, who will buy products manufactured there as like the same in Germany? Russia at first hesitated, especially Putin. But right now the rules are very strict and there is no sign of lightening them. We have to see if Russia is really in such a good position. We don't know at the moment. Japan was in a good position in the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak, but it seems that the government was a little late in reacting on this crisis, especially in terms of testing. Today, the health system is under great pressure. The intensive care beds are only on a ratio of 5 for 100,000 citizens. Even Italy has 12 per 100,000 citizens, so the outcome isn't yet clear. The number of unknown cases might be higher than in other countries. Japan tested 5 times less than South Korea. And as much as we know, testing is essential. So the outcome and the aftermath for the Japanese economy and their local struggle with China are not clear to foresee right now. The Indian lockdown is, as we know now, the strictest on the whole world right now. The healthcare system could be in a better shape, so I'm not sure if India really is less affected in comparison to other countries on the long term. At the moment, we see very small numbers in India. And it's true that the outbreak are minor, but India is a very dense populated nation in some places. So we should expect some more problems in the future. But on the other hand, you have the advantage of a very, very young population. So I'm quite positive about India that it will overcome this pandemic and conquer the situation, conquer the virus. How will it impact international organizations? If the US continues the path America first and further move back their own engagement, then we might see a stronger rise of China's influence. Peter Rimmele isn't expecting it, as I understood it correctly, but as we see that the US is pushing back, there might be a hole to fill in for others, especially for China. And if we see that the US is not taking their shares in UN organizations, others will do and will take their influence. So I think that will be a big topic. And on the other hand, it will be again under the situation of the coming elections in November this year in the US. Everything will be part of the interior politics. And at least, how will it impact or help Germany's medium and long-term visions for itself? Well, as I mentioned, Germany is only prosper if the EU and the world market is doing as well, so that we can sell our products and interact with other countries and economies. And we might see a stronger focus on domestic productions. We talked about it before because of the strong Chinese influence. And we expect that after this pandemic, the discussion and the situation will focus again and stronger on domestic, not only national, but European productions and supply chains. So this crisis won't change the German outline for a strong EU. And as Peter Rimmel cited, it might be a chance to develop in a crisis for the European Union. And I think that we could use this chance. But all in all, we will have big problems at the moment and within the next month and probably years. Thanks.
Mr. Arsh, please take over.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. Let me also begin this conversation by thanking MMA and KS on behalf of WARF for organizing this together. And special thanks to Sri Narayanan for agreeing to do this with us today. It's wonderful to have him. It's wonderful to share a platform with him and to have a discussion on a topic which perhaps is animating a lot of this conversation. Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Whose views we heard just now, laying the broader landscape for us as we take this conversation forward. Now, just very briefly, Sri Narayanan needs no introduction.
Narayan, please unmute. Mohan, unmute Mr. Narayan.
Those of us, us who follow Indian landscape, they know him very well. We have heard, we listen to his views regularly. Very prominently the National Security Advisor in the Manmohan Singh government from 2005 to 2010, and then the governor of the state of West Bengal from 2010 to 2014. One of India's finest civil servants, one of the most prominent thinkers in India, and one who has remained engaged with the public policy issues of the day. He continues to write, he continues to talk about them regularly, so it's a pleasure to have him here today. Sir, if you allow me, I can begin the conversation. If you want to say some introductory remarks, you're most welcome to do.
No, let's not waste too much time on preliminary remarks. I think you've been far too generous with your comments. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Peter Rimmel and Mr. Hurt for their remarks. So carry on. Let's start the discussion.
Thank you. So the way we have organized this conversation, economics, as the title of the chat today underscores, and we'll also be dealing with the larger issues around India in the third segment before taking on some questions. Now, one of the things that had been happening regularly, I think we have been discussing this even before COVID-19 crisis struck us all, is that there was a lot of in the international system. Tectonic plates of the global politics were shifting even before the advent of this crisis. So one of the aspects that I would like to sort of talk and looking at it particularly in the first instance, as we have talked, we have heard Peter and we have heard Christian both talk about how the Chinese factor is impacting particularly Europe. But I think in the larger context of global geopolitics, you have the rise of China, which is becoming a reality. And in some ways, this the way global pandemic this has shaped and exposed Chinese vulnerability back in various parts of the world. Every day in the news, we hear some country or the other raising concerns. We have had, I think today's news reports talk of Australia, China. And I wanted to understand from your perspective, when you look at the rise of China in the context of this crisis, how do you evaluate that rise and how do you think post this crisis, once at this rise and think about the consequences, would it be different from the past or would it be a continuation of what we have been discussing over the last decade?
I hope you'll pardon me if I moved away from the question that you asked just now, because I was greatly struck by the comments made by Mr. Peter Rimmel and Mr. Hurt. And they talked a lot in terms of international cooperation. They talked in terms of the global community, etc. My own assessment is that one of the devastating impacts of the COVID-19 is that nations are going to look even more inwards rather than outwards. I think the concept of an international community is going to become narrower in many ways. Therefore, people are nations rather, would like to look at how to husband their own resources, how to deal with issues of the kind. The vast majority of nations would be in that frame. I think the only country in the world today which is really, in a sense, trying to utilize or exploit the situation is, if I might use that term, is China. The rest of us are trying to husband our resources, trying to see that the situation does not go out of control within our own borders. And the total failure of international organizations, the UN Security Council, the United Nations organization itself, I think has failed the world because they've only concentrated on the military threat. The COVID pandemic is far graver than any military threat that we have ever faced since 1945. And yet, the UN Security Council dithered for days before talking about it. The WHO has now been tarred by various charges and allegations, whether true or not, but clearly the image of the WHO has been diminished to a considerable extent. So to begin with, my point really is that what is the world that we are emerging into after the COVID-19 pandemic? Every nation is in some ways licking the wounds created or caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. As I said, the country which should have been stigmatized because that's where the pandemic started, and they failed to alert the world at least for about 6 weeks before the thing really went out of control, thanks to the lockdown in Wuhan and other measures that they've taken, has probably had an early recovery and is now trying to exploit the situation. So we have today one country in the world which is looking at how to utilize or exploit the opportunities that have become available rather than trying to help these countries. So does that answer your question? I mean, where does China stand? Because there are a whole lot of things about China. But I think principally, I would like to know from you whether you agree with me on this point that China, rather than helping, though it has now become from a black swan, it has turned white. It is trying to sort of help by sending out masks and equipment and whatnot to various countries at this point. But clearly, this is not the world that we want to live in. We would have expected international organizations to play this role. We would have expected nations to all join the effort to create a suitable platform in how to deal with a pandemic, of which probably is going to be far worse than the Black Plague and whatnot that we have faced in the past. So my point really is that we need to take a good, hard look at what China is up to at this moment. Over to you, Harsh. What would you like me to say?
I think you make this pandemic should, in a sense.
Harsh, if I might interrupt, I'm losing you from time to time. There's some problem with your audio, I think. Is it? I don't know if it's on my side or no. Quite a few of your sentences get sort of lost.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Then you go off at critical moments, so to say. Anyway, carry on. Whatever it is, you can. Yeah.
Oh, I'll try to be a bit slow, so
no,
that at least the audio problem
I don't think it has anything to do with the addiction. Something to do with the equipment, probably. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, okay. Let's see what we can do with that. I mean, I think you made a very interesting point about this China, and I think if you think about this crisis in an ideal world, this should have been this is the high point of liberal institutionalism. Institutions, it's a non-traditional security threat, and perhaps the world can come together and integrate and work in a manner that perhaps. I think the point that I would also like you to talk about a bit is this pushback. It is slight. It is in its nascent stage. Heard some very strong words from the French president, from Britain. Of course, Mr. Trump has said some very strong things. Now Australia has called for an independent investigation
Yeah,
This
okay.
will become a trend now.
No, I mean, I think the whole issue as to whether the COVID-19 virus was created in a lab in Wuhan or this and that, or China is responsible, I think is well beyond, I think, you and me. Because most people say that a virus of this kind can't be really cultured in a lab. It requires a human, an animal involvement, etc. So I don't want to go into that. But the issue is how do, at a time when the world wants everybody to cooperate, we are seeing to a considerable extent an effort by one nation which is responsible for not having alerted the rest of the world to the dangerous portents of the pandemic, is trying to utilize the whole situation. I mean, you see sinocentrism of a particular kind taking place in this whole system. And they are now at this moment attempting to see whether they can build on this to create the image that they have, because you have a faltering United States. The only country, the other country in the world that had the ability, the strength, and the moral stature to stand up and do something of this kind was the United States. But I think the United States, for a variety of reasons, I do not want to only blame President Trump for this, I think it has been sliding down the slippery slope from the heights that it had in the earlier part of this century, and even towards the, of course, much more so towards since 1991. So in the absence, there's a big vacuum. International organizations were not able to fill that vacuum. Most countries, as I said, were looking inwards. So China is trying to do this, but the way it is doing it is a matter which is a matter of utmost concern. On the economic, if you look at the geoeconomics of it, for instance, looked at most of the economies, the financial viability of many of the companies and institutions and banks have been hollowed out. And China is trying to step into that breach by buying into these depleted stocks, depleted values of stocks, etc. And by and large, trying to take advantage of the misfortunes of much of the world. I think this is the thing that causes the world. And in a sense, we are seeing a great shift from the global order that we had since 1945 to a new one, an uncertain one. And clearly in the lead role in this at the moment, I think, is China. And I think the world knows that China is not a great believer in the basics of international conduct and behavior. And therefore, that causes a great deal of concern across the world. And since, as I said, the United Nations, even the WHO and other organizations have, in a sense, failed to perform what they should be doing, we are in a position that are we at the mercy of China is the question that really comes to mind. And if we are at the mercy of China, how does the world react? We heard Mr. Peter Rimmel, to a lesser extent Mr. Hurd, talk in terms of Europe and Europe. I think Europe is in no position to really stand up to, if I might use the word, the Chinese juggernaut. And I think there are several issues that come up from this, and I'm willing to explain that if you ask me point by point. Over to you, Harsh.
Yeah. So you raise these two issues, which I want to club together. I think where we have had this issue of certain lack of leadership. And this, I think, the point that you also touched upon in your comments is a few years, and now specifically in this crisis. Traditionally, America was the one that used to rally the world around, and the West used to be the one that used to be to have moved away from that in this particular case. And I think if you look at the US, how would you evaluate, is Mr. Trump an aberration, or this is now the new normal as far as US foreign policy is concerned?
Yeah, I mean, I'm treading on dangerous ground here while talking about leaderships across the world. But quite clearly, I think that's a point, and I was really going to stress on the leadership issue when it came to Europe. I mean, Mr. Ramel talked in terms about it. I think the real challenge across the world today is the absence of, what should I say, top flight leaders. In Europe, for instance, I think we have only one leader. I know I can be challenged on this, but I think Angela Merkel is the one leader that we have had in Europe now for at least the past decade and more. And nobody there now who can substitute for it. I know the French president is being touted, etc., but clearly he's unable to manage his own country in many ways, and therefore he can hardly. I think Europe is in a very bad state, but that is true of. I want to talk of the United States. Quite clearly, people talk of the United States, of the Roosevelts and Clintons and Obamas and whatnot. But who can compare President what's his name? The president with these leaders? So you run into issues because in times of crisis, leadership is critical. Across the world, we have a great vacuum and great absence of good and powerful leaders. People who can think well beyond their immediate problems, well beyond their immediate surroundings, and are able to take and have the moral courage to take on issues which go right across. So that's where COVID-19 is going to really destroy the world, because we don't have at this moment, I would say across the world, leaders of real high quality who can take the issue beyond their immediate time. Each individual country may be able to sort out their problems to some extent, but can they move beyond that? Can they move well beyond? I mean, you take the United Nations, UN Secretary General today, compare him with the giants of the past. You find that there is this crisis of leadership. In that sense, the two countries where there are leaders of some sort who at least have some kind of control over their country and beyond are Xi Jinping in China and Putin in Russia. So when you come to the democratic world, we find a total absence of worthwhile leaders who can provide leadership, who can provide a sense of direction, who can provide a way out of the darkness into which the world has been plunged as a result of COVID-19. So if you ask me about leadership, I think the biggest vacuum that exists today is of top-ranking leaders across the world, and particularly the more important countries in the world.
Thank you, sir. And so one of the sorry. This lack of leadership occasionally is by building institutions. Now, and that's the whole role that institutions play in terms of managing a global point. We have talked about multilateralism and the crisis of multilateralism. You have talked about United Nations and WHO, etc. Where do we go in terms of the institutional fabric? This can be repaired, or do you think that this needs a bottom-up or top-down overhaul?
As things stand, I think what you said, the last words that you uttered are valid. I think you really require a bottom-up approach, but who will do it? There are no leaders of such stature who can do that. We don't have a Churchill or a Roosevelt or that matter, even a Stalin at that point to create the United Nations and that kind of stuff. So I think what we really need to do is to start having the small building blocks and build it up into, because I think a top-down approach is not going to arrive in the near future. Take the case of Europe, which is the other major center of democracy in the world. Is Europe? I'm sorry if I'm contradicting both Mr. Ramel and Mr. Herd. I think Europe is today in a position that it can hardly define its own problems. What to say about the rest of handling situations across the rest of the world. And if that is the state of the problem with Europe, that includes, I mean, UK is no longer part of Europe, but post-Brexit, UK is in exactly the same position. Germany is the one country in Europe which could possibly have provided a sense of leadership. But today it's become insular. And as I said, with the absence of Angela Merkel, I don't think there is a leadership there which can take forward. So that if you take Europe out of the picture, North America is, a catastrophic state. Okay? The less said about South America. You take in Asia, we have West Asia in total shambles. I mean, one doesn't know where India could have provided, but India, I think the economic situation is looking darker and darker, and I think just holding our own is going to be a problem for us. Forget about providing succor to people across even South Asia and beyond. So you again and again you come back to this one narrow area, China. And as I said, is China capable of providing enlightened leadership? I hardly think so. There's nothing that in Chinese history which shows enlightened leadership. And today, by virtue of the fact that it is in some ways the world's manufacturing hub, even if it has come down recently, but it's still much better than the rest of the world. At the height of the pandemic, we are now looking to China again for getting most of the material for the kits that we want, even masks and things like that. So, in a sense, the way I see it is the geopolitics of the world is going to be saying we have a China, which alone probably will come out of the ruins of what the post-COVID pandemic will leave, with something like basic strength. There is Russia, which may not be as badly affected as many other countries at the moment. But I think thanks to the arrangement that is had on the oil situation with Saudis and etc., may survive, but still is incapable of providing leadership, Putin notwithstanding. And therefore, which country in the world can provide you the leadership that you want? Who will lead the charge for setting up, restarting international institutions and giving them the kind of status that they deserve to be able to take on the problem? Who will look at the issues in Africa? Who has the material and moral authority to do that? So that's a problem that we really need to look at. The geopolitics is frightening. In some ways, the geopolitics is even worse than the geoeconomics. Everybody talks in terms of the growth rate going. Negative growth rate is what the World Bank has predicted for most countries. Only a few countries are like India and others have got a 1 or 2% growth rate. But the point really is you have the biggest vacuum as far as geopolitics. Who is going to show the way for recovery in terms of international institutions, international conduct, international community?
Hello.
So since you talked about geoeconomics, I would like to come to geoeconomics now, and I would like to sort of, you said that geopolitics look much more frightening than geoeconomics. Now, if you look back at the debate on economic globalization, which was going on before COVID-19, the rise of economic nationalism, deglobalization, etc. Now, that seems to this crisis seems to have accelerated that process in some way. An embrace of economic globalization, or is it something? Are we entering into uncharted territory here?
Let me explain why I think the geopolitical situation is far worse than the geoeconomic situation. The geopolitical situation, if countries are unable to manage their affairs, what economics are we going to talk about? You first require a certain degree of order and political management before you can allow economic development to take place on any worthwhile scale. So that's why I was stressing the point of geopolitics. Not that geoeconomics is any less important. The critical element there is that if you don't have a state, what economics are we going to really talk? And I see many states in many ways imploding. I don't say in physical terms, but in terms of all that we thought of or talked about over the years. When you come to geoeconomics, I think where are we going to start? I was very much there in 2008 as a national security advisor, when the meetings took place in 2008, 2009, etc., at the height of the subprime crisis and whatnot. And I could see the kind of, what you may say, the utter sort of confusion that exists amongst the leaders. And it took a lot of effort to overcome that. But we still had a number of leaders. And certainly, I think there were good economists at the time who were. I think that even those, the economists of that time, political leaders who had economic sense, have all come down very greatly. So the problem that I see is that each nation here is now going to try to handle the situation to the best of its own ability. And that, I think, can turn out to be the biggest mistake if you're talking in terms of an international world, I mean a global world, an international world, etc. So it's not a question of whether it's 2% here or 5%. Everybody is talking. The one country again, which seems to have pretty deep reserves, seems to be China, and therefore it may be able to manage not only its economy but economies over much of the rest of many parts of the world better than it will. But for the most countries, India included, how to prevent the situation from resulting in even deeper recession is going to be the basic issue. Now, who's going to look at this problem? Where are the economists of stature who can also manage not merely the economics but the political economics of these issues? Without that, you can't manage the situation. So, I think before the COVID-19 pandemic pans out, I think people must start thinking on these lines. We must get across the world people to sort of sit together and work together. I think the IMF, the World Bank, and others should start working on some plans of this kind, because otherwise, if each individual country is trying to find a way out of the morass that we are in, I think we're doomed to fail.
So, sir, when we look at economic interdependence, for example, if you think about the center point of globalization in some ways, and how that was seen as a counterpoint to conflict, that greater economic interdependence leads to less conflict was the argument. Now, increasingly, there seems to be a sense that economic interdependence can also be leveraged for geopolitical heft. China has been doing it all across the world very effectively, apparently. So the concern, therefore, is that economic interdependence also gets a bad name, and therefore the larger project of economic globalization also gets into a backsliding mode. So, as you find today, global supply chains are being restructured. There was, you have our friends from Germany talking about this crisis. There is greater degree of discussion in India about about the FDI, for example, from China, etc. Where do we how do you assess this trend? Because this is going to be tangling the economic ties that we have created with the wider world, and then creating new ties, new supply chains, new lines of communication.
Yeah. No, you're right. I think this is fun. This is fundamental. But Harsh, the point is, I think even before the pandemic, I think globalization had started, was almost beginning to be seen as a bad word. I think there was a great retreat from globalization. When globalization became the hot topic, the West particularly thought that this was an opportunity for them to sort of, markets are open, etc., etc., etc. Things have changed. Globalization has been in retreat definitely for the last 3-4 years. And I think the pandemic is going to greatly exacerbate that situation. That's what I'm saying. We are already seeing changes which have been taking place. The pandemic is only exacerbating those changes or accentuating those changes. So exactly what you really need to look at are the new set of Bretton Woods twins. You are in a new world, a new situation. It's no longer dominated by one country like the United States, 1945, and for the next 20, 30 years. One country probably which is in the driving seat to some extent is China, but it's nowhere near what the United States was at that time. And each country is in a sense licking the wounds from the economic recession that they have faced. Populations are large, the problems are so much, and people's expectations have also grown tremendously, particularly in Asia, Africa, South America, etc. So if we don't do this properly, you are going to run into major issues regarding law and order. I mean, I'm not talking of revolution so much, but I think as recessions intensify, people are going to come out into the street, and you can't deal with the situation by mere law and order measures. I think it's important for the world to recognize how close we are to, I don't want to use the word Armageddon, but how close we could be if the pandemic continues to devastate economies as they are. Is anybody really looking at this issue? I'm not sure. At least I've not seen any debate. I read, I think, magazines, newspapers, articles, etc. There's no, everybody talks in terms of, over the economic recession with bottoming out or intensifying, or the geopolitics is being sort of maintained in a particular fashion, etc. But I think we are at the cusp of what I think is a fundamental shift in the. Do remember that pandemics have changed dynasties world over. If you look at the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, everybody comes. So we need to be careful that all these situations can be revisited on us if we don't take adequate care. Some people, at least some elder statesmen, should step back and see what we need to do. Overcome let those in charge, the political leaders in charge, maintain the present situation. But there are enough wise heads across the world who can look at this kind of thing. But you need leadership. And as you rightly said at the very beginning, the biggest default in the system is the absence of leadership, of a leader or some leaders who can galvanize the rest of the world to function in a particular fashion.
There are some questions that are coming in, and I just would like to say that I'll take them at the end of this conversation. I have a few more questions to raise with Mr. Narayanan, and then
okay.
Narayanan, sir, once again, a few questions, a few final questions for you, which are largely on India's role and India's debate within India. Thinking about it, this has been talked of. This crisis has been talked of as an opportunity also for India. We have heard Indian Prime Minister talking of one of the big lessons, said that India needs to be now welcoming the companies that are moving out of China. Now, do you think India is in a position to explain the immediate aftermath of this crisis to make it possible for us to leverage some of this opportunity, if you believe there is an opportunity here for India?
I would like to believe that. In any case, I do not wish to contradict our Prime Minister in this matter. But I think I've been a practitioner of politics of one kind, not as an elected member. But I don't think that today India's situation is such that we can exploit what might seem that there is a diminution in China. If the COVID-19 epidemic had not taken place, and China's economy was faltering, and India's was on the rise, as was to be hoped, then there were expectations. But the point really is that Most people are flocking towards China even now. That's where they would like to be. And China holds all the cards. What are the cards that India has? I mean, this lockdown very important from the point of view of restricting the spread of the pandemic. But it's in a sense bottomed out what our capacities, economic capacity, and it's going to take a long time. There are other countries. I mean, I think some countries like Vietnam and others are probably in a better position to exploit what is happening than India in this regard. We have the resilience. We have the mental caliber to manage. But I think the economy has done us down in that sense. I think it would be a lot of wishful thinking if we think that we can exploit whatever China. And my point is, China has recovered. I mean, it started, its manufacturing, it started, it is moving, okay, it's buying stocks across the world. So where are we compared to China? I think it's a bit of wishful thinking to think that we can take advantage of or exploit the situation created by the diminution of China's economic capabilities. I hope I've answered your question.
I would like you to take this forward a bit in terms of India's China policy as well. So where do you see India's China policy? We are seeing, as you in your comments point out, there is a sentiment, public sentiment against China because of what has happened, because of its mismanagement. But how far can relationship, which for all practical purposes also remains a very vital relationship for us, despite all the problems?
Yeah, I agree with you. It is a vital relationship. It's probably the most important relationship today across the world, because I think, irrespective of what has happened with the COVID-19 pandemic, China and India are going to be the two important countries of the 21st and maybe early 22nd centuries. They're two ancient civilizations, but they're different civilizations. There is one fundamental difference, and let me tell you, and I have it from some of the top Chinese leaders that I interacted with over the years, particularly in the years that I was National Security Advisor and Head of Intelligence. The Chinese have a healthy respect or concern about India or India's intellectual capabilities. They don't understand how religion and culture play such an important part in India's life. They see Indians are able to think both spatially and in linear fashion, something that they are not able to do. So they regard India as a far braver threat than many of the other countries which are present across the globe at this moment. So there is a challenge. There's also an opportunity. I think I don't think I'm too far wrong, because I think I've interacted with Chinese leaders of several generations, that China and India will have another conflict in the near future. Because I think there's much that both countries would lose. There is a challenge that both countries will pose to each other in terms of influence, in terms of what their capabilities can be, etc., and how they influence countries in their neighborhood. At the moment, China is able, because of its economic strength and the juggernaut that it has become, to sort of influence countries, even in South Asia, offering them assistance, because many of them have their economies affected by the COVID pandemic. But India has far greater inherent strengths of various kinds. So there is this constant challenge that will take place. The Chinese efforts, I mean, China is now taking advantage of the fact that the rest of the world is so concerned about the COVID epidemic. They moved into the South China Sea full tilt, East China Sea. They moved also into the Indian Ocean. Fine. These are all efforts to tell the rest of the world, overall the rest of the world. I do not think that we are in a conflict situation. In any case, I do not think that any Chinese leader is willing to have a conflict with India, because that will cost China it will of course cost India too. So the conflict will be more in terms of which is the philosophy, which is the economic potential, which will have greater cancer. So I think that's where we need to look at it. So we need to maintain good relations with China to the extent that both countries do not have to overspend on each other and keep fighting each other. At the same time, we need to be wary because the Chinese would be unhappy to see India on the same table as themselves. And I think they recognize intellectually and in many ways we are not only their equals, but maybe in many ways they're superior to them. So it's a very interesting kind of a relationship that we have between India and China. It requires a great deal of very deft handling, great deal of intellectual depth to understand how to deal with the problem. And I think the Chinese recognize that. I, for one, feel that it's not so much about having one layer or two layers to protect Delhi, which is the issue today. How do we meet the Chinese? How do you make the rest of at least the Asian region recognize that India is a far better country to have as your friend rather than China? That, I think, is a challenge that we face.
So just before we end and I bring in some of the viewers' questions to you, I would like you to conclude this conversation by looking at the broader, have some ideas, if you can throw in some of the things that you've been thinking about, especially as the geopolitics and geoeconomics will change post-COVID India. I think some of that you answered in your previous question as well. But I would like you to articulate it a bit more about India's future role in the world and what expectations should ordinary Indians have.
I think India is too important a country to be sidelined in the world. I mean, there are periods, and we are unfortunate that at a time when we were moving forward, that the pandemic has put a brake on our problems. And even before that, the economy had started faltering to some extent. But I think India needs to look at. I know I'm probably exceeding my brief in saying this. That I think Indian foreign policy has invested too much in the United States. I think whatever might have been the failures that people attribute to non-alignment and whatnot, and talk in terms of multi-alignment, etc. I think we need to take a look at the world in a fashion, because the world is getting reordered in many ways. Indian foreign policy and Indian diplomatic efforts need to be centered more on what we see are the new changes that are taking place, rather than depending too much on the United States, which was at one time the most important country in the world. But it's certainly not. The US, I'm sorry to have to make that statement, is in deep trouble. Many people refer to it as a failing state, and therefore to hitch our wagon to the US is, I think, would be unfortunate. Likewise, many of our relationships with Europe, for instance, as I said a few minutes ago, I think for quite some time to come, Europe is not going to be able to even define its own problems, let alone play a role in world affairs. So I think our relationship with Europe will also need to be restored. Yes, we have a good relationship with Russia, but I think we need to work a little more on that. How to deal with China would become important. But more important than anything else, how does India prove to the rest of the world that it can be a beacon of light and a factor of strength in a world where there are no permanent relationships and structures? I think that's a big challenge. I think it's very important for us to understand that. As the economy will recover. As the economy recovers, this will become very fundamentally important for us to manage. But clearly, we need our sights probably. We need not be assigned. We should not be carried away by the hugs and sort of thing by various nations across the world. I think we are capable of handling situations. We need to be on good terms with countries across the globe. I think the most important relationship that we will have, at least for the next 2 to 3 decades, will be China. How do we manage a relation with China? Yeah, Pakistan will always be a problem for us, but I think we need to handle that. We need to strengthen our position in South Asia. I mean, I think somehow SAARC has to be brought back into the picture. Unless we are seen as the glue that puts SAARC together, whether you like BIMSTEC or any of the other various subordinate organizations, I think you must manage your own affairs. And I think India is situated in a region which I think has considerable potential. I think it needs to work very hard. Once you have SAARC, then we have a good relationship with Vietnam, we have a good relationship. Once we strengthen ourselves in Asia, then I think the rest of the world will certainly see more. Africa is a country that we invested so much, but we have lost a great deal of that thing. Every time I speak somewhere and I see the African delegations, they no longer look to India. They're looking somewhere else. I think we need to bring that back. So I think the opportunities are great, but we need to get the radar should be probably sort of tuned to the situation. Okay. Not able to hear.
Asking this question about Mr. Modi's outreach to SAARC during the COVID crisis, and if India Pakistan cannot get along even during COVID-19, does this relationship have a future?
Every relationship has a future. You can work hard on it. You need to keep your mind set on it. It's not easy. No relationship is easy. Maintaining a relationship. After all, India and the United States were in a matter. I mean, who would have thought that India and the United States would agree on a nuclear deal? When I was charged with this task, my first task as a national security advisor, everybody just scoffed at it. But it did. It required, I mean, I'm not saying that I played a particular role, but it required a President Bush, it required a Manmohan Singh to so if the leaders are willing to do that, you can carry on. We can, yeah, there'll always be pinpricks between neighbors, etc. I think we can deal with Pakistan. In any case, Pakistan is no. If you read the history of Pakistan, you will realize that we shouldn't get unduly concerned about what Pakistan. They'll create problems for us. But we need to be able to control the situation in a manner that if you're not the dominant power in SAARC, then how can you talk in terms of relationships elsewhere? I mean, it's possible. I'm quite clear. You don't have to sort of hug Pakistan to your bosom, but the fact of the matter is you can deal with Pakistan. You have to deal with Pakistan. And that, I think, is, and Indian diplomats are amongst the best in the world. And therefore, that should not be a problem that is beyond the ken for anybody else. But if India and Pakistan are not so hostile, then the India-China relationship also. I mean, there is a triangular or quadrangular relationship that takes place in all these matters. And then the smaller countries will not play games with us thereafter.
So, sir, I have now a few questions which have been posed to me. You know, you have talked a lot about leadership and the vacuum in global leadership. In that context, there has been a question about how do you perceive the leadership skills shown by Indian Prime Minister during this crisis? Do you think he has been able to make the global outreach possible, even at the same time he's confronting difficult domestic issues? This is a point that
no, I think at the moment
takes an Indian leadership.
No, I think at the moment the Indian Prime Minister has shown leadership because he's dealing with a crisis as far as India is concerned. I don't think he has wasted too much time in trying to deal with the problems beyond the shores of India. And I think he has a difficult task. I think he's managing it reasonably well. There are several issues that can be handled. The question is that just now this is good enough. But I think the lockdown has to be lifted. We have to start relationships with countries across our neighbors and beyond. And it is at that time that we will have to see whether the leadership that can really sort of reach out to the rest of the world and deal with issues. Therefore, as of now, when dealing with the pandemic within the country, I think the Indian leadership has managed it pretty well. But quite clearly, we have to step down from the tiger that we have been riding for the last few weeks, and we'll have to see what is happening thereafter. But the question you're asking is how will that sort of what's the relationship that will have with our relation to the rest of the world? We will have to wait and see. It's difficult to say. So we need to, because we shouldn't allow other countries to exploit what is really our inherent. Okay.
So there is another question which is I think a fairly interesting one, in the sense decades has been premised on the high rates of economic growth. And I think India's rise to global leadership is also premised on those economic growth rates. Now, as economic growth rates the global leader, do you think there are other mechanisms through which India can show global leadership? Because economic growth rates clearly would be very difficult, the kind of that we have experienced in the past.
No, you know, it is possible. I mean, take India in the late 40s and the 50s. I know Pandit Nehru is not the most favored leader in India today, but quite clearly, at the time when India's economic situation was certainly, in many ways, the pits, if I might use so, and the Hindu rate of growth dominated the India, and the pejorative term that way, India still provided leadership. India reached out to Africa. The non-aligned movement created a constituency, a community of nations of various kinds. India was a country that many of the world countries reached to whenever they wanted to compromise. You take the Panmunjom conference in Korea in 1951. You know, it's possible. It's definitely possible. And in India, that doesn't matter which government it is. Indian leaders, Indian diplomats, Indian bureaucrats have the capacity to be able to do this. And I think we will do it. Yes, if you're stronger economically, it makes it easier. But it's not entirely dependent on doling out economic aid. Doling out economic aid helps, but is not the final arbiter of a nation's destiny.
So from my part, thank you very much for this. Thank you for taking time off with great patience. You took all the questions. Thank you so much, and I'll hand it back to
Sorry to intervene. Thank you, Mr. Pant. So there are a couple of questions which has come from YouTube and other sources. May I have with your permission, can I read out those questions for you to answer them, sir? With your permission. The first question, can India hope to compete with China in funding and financing India's neighbors in a big way, which will be an important for political and strategic reasons? What's your view on this?
No, I didn't follow. What? Well, India?
Can India hope to compete with China in funding and financing India's neighbors in a big way, which will be an important for political and strategic reasons?
Well, at the moment, I don't think India is in a position to do much, but it has always been a race. And that's where I think diplomacy plays a role, because money is important, but money is not everything. And I think, as I've mentioned to you, even at a time when India's economic strength was nowhere near what it is today, we were able to influence nations in our neighborhood and well beyond our neighborhood into that. We don't have to compete with China. I mean, most countries that receive aid from China are uncomfortable with it, because the Chinese are the ultimate in extracting every single point of what they make out of it. So Indians, wherever they've gone, have made friends. The Chinese are by no means friends. The Chinese are feared. Indians, I don't know whether they're loved, but the Indians are not hated by agents of the time. So I think it's possible for us. But I think a great deal depends on how you leverage your strengths. And that I think is possible for us. We've done it in the past. We're doing it even now. And I think we should be able to do that in the future as well.
Thank you, sir. General Dipankar is there. You would like to ask a question. Over to you, Mr. Dipankar.
Yes, sir. This is General Dipankar Banerjee. Lovely to see you, sir. After so many decades of national service, you're looking very well. And of course, from the responses that you gave to Harsh Pant, your mind is sharper than it ever was in the past, may I dare say.
Thank you.
It is also not so well known, sir, that...
No, before you go, thank you, Dipankar, but I find you've lost all your hair.
Ah, absolutely, sir. Many years have gone by, as you would expect. So, many people do not know that you're also one of our leading experts on China. You engaged Dai Bingguo for the maximum number of times at a special representative level and had a very deep understanding of Chinese policies and Chinese background, how they make policies, etc. And in that context, may I ask you, sir, how do you see China in the post-COVID-19 era? You know, it is a time of great changes. Pandemics bring fundamental reorientations. Is China going to find it more easy to deal with the world now, or will it be on the back foot with the many reverses that it suffered in its relations with the world recently? And following from that, sir, may I request you to kindly address, at this critical moment in the history of the world, how do you see India shaping its policies now? Apart from the challenges, it's a major opportunity for India. How can we exploit the opportunities to further our national interests? Thank you, sir.
Wow, I think it's a whole 1 hour more. I don't know.
It's a brief answer.
No, Dipankar, thank you for referring to my past. But I want to tell you that my links with China go way back to 1962. I don't want to mention about 62 because that isn't a particularly bright spot in my intelligence career.
Okay, sir, I didn't know that.
Yeah. But the point is that, yes, I spent years, I think 5 full years dealing with Dai Bingguo, not only Dai Bingguo, the whole host of Chinese civil servants and diplomats that we were there. I also had the opportunity to talk to both Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, etc. So I have some idea of the present, I would say the more recent crop of Chinese leaders. And I have a good understanding of Chinese communism and Chinese communist thought, etc. One thing is very clear. China will recognize strength in any sense of the term. China will resent India's attempts to replace it as the dominant power in the region or beyond. China is at the same time careful of the fact they realize that India is perhaps the one country that has inherent strength to take it on. I don't think that China will ever think in terms of a conflict with India any longer. 1962 was an aberration. What they would like to do is to sort of, the most favorite game of the Chinese is Wei Qi. That is, they will try to sort of constrict India to such an extent that India is finally isolated from the rest of the world. I think it lies in India's power to challenge China. Yes, we have ups and downs. We are fortunate that we have faced many downs so that we know how to recover from that faster than many countries. I think the COVID pandemic will bring us down, no doubt, but I think we have the ability to recover faster than many countries, certainly faster than the West, I should think. So I think India will be in a position to deal with it. China will try to exploit the situation that it has recovered from the pandemic earlier than most other countries. It will try to see whether it can use whatever opportunities are available to strengthen itself. But I think the rest of the world has recovered fast enough to realize that what China is up to. I think that is the opportunity that India has. It should not let itself be sort of constrained by the fact that the economic growth has slipped down to, say, 3% or 2.8% from 7 or 8% that exists here. We can manage that. the economy will recover in course of time, but I think we are capable of answering the demands and requirements of the rest of the world diplomatically and otherwise in terms of services, if not in terms of money. So I think the future is certainly not dark. The present may be a little disturbing, but I think we certainly have the capability to take advantage. China and India will be, I would say, the two countries, definitely as far as the Asian region is concerned and extending into Africa. I think the major challengers of the existing order. We'll allow the United States or the West to fend for itself, because I think they're going to go through a very difficult period, far more difficult than I think what Asia and others are going to face. But I think, as I mentioned once again, leadership is important. We need a leadership that will go beyond the immediacy of India, and people of the rest of Asia and beyond accept it. And I think it's possible for us to muster that kind of leadership at this moment. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, sir. Before I go for one last question, may I check with Mr. Peter Rimmel and Mr. Christine? Do you have any questions to Mr. Narayanan before I move to the question which has come to me from the Facebook, sir? No questions, sir? Mr. Peter?
Thank you. Thank you. No question.
Thank you, sir. One question which has come from the Facebook viewer. How are nations going to improve export markets to shore up their foreign exchange positions, keep their job, and answer domestic demands?
If I knew the answer, I'd be the finance minister of India. Frankly, I have no answer. I have really no answer for that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. It's been a fascinating evening. We come to the end of the program, and thank you so much, Mr. Peter Rimmel and Mr. Christine, for joining us and sharing your insight. Mr. Narayanan, as always, as usual, it's been fascinating to hear you every time. Thank you, Mr. Pant. Now I request our partner from the ORF, Mr. Satyamurthy, to formally say thanks. Mr. Satyamurthy, over to you, sir.
Good evening, everybody. And I'm not going to take much time. It was a very useful and a meaningful evening, I think we all had. Professor Pant's questions were short, and Mr. Narayan's answers were focused. This is a kind of interaction that would benefit all of us and also the nation as a whole, because we are looking at the post-COVID India, post-COVID world, and post-COVID India in the post-COVID world. That's going to be very exciting and challenging. But as Mr. Narayan said, it's also a very great opportunity for India. How we play out is a main issue here. Not that we can't play out, as you really pointed about the 40s and the 50s and 60s, when we didn't have the plywood, but we had a moral authority and we knew how to go about it with others. My own feeling is that the UN in the coming years, General Assembly is going to be as important, if not more, than the Security Council. This is where we can play our cards, I hope. With that, I thank Mr. Narayanan for taking time for us, Mr. Pant for leading the conversation, Mr. Peter Rimmel and German MD President, and of course Pankaj Madan and our partners Vijay and the team MMA. So they have been putting up these events for the past 1 month, not just only in the evening, but throughout the day, at least 3 or 4 programs a day, and starting with the yoga lesson in the morning, of all things. And a quiz, business quiz, etc., and we will be doing more of these cooperative ventures. In fact, we are planning some in the throughout this COVID period. Unfortunately, thanks to COVID, we couldn't do it, so we ended up doing this online. Thank you, everybody. Again, good night.
Thank you, Mr. Satyamurthy, and thank you, gentlemen. We have come to the end of a fascinating event. Again, we look forward to seeing you, and we thank Christine, for joining us from Germany, sir. It's a great privilege and honor you joined us. Narayanan, thank you so much. You have taken time to be with us and share your insight. Thanks, Pankaj. Thanks, Mr. Peter Rimmel and the Tank team, CAS, for all the support which enabled us to take some excellent program to the large number of MA members. Thank you so much. Stay safe, stay healthy, and